The air in the transport capsule was an exercise in engineered perfection, a sterile cocktail of oxygen and noble gases chilled to the precise temperature the Galactic Concord deemed optimal for interspecies comfort. Dr. Aristhorn hated it. It was the air of a museum, of a tomb, a place where life was observed but never truly lived. He felt the familiar, subtle pressure in his ears as the capsule ascended the conquered spire, a crystalline needle that stretched from the swirling, methane-rich cloud tops of the gas giant Xylos into the hard vacuum of space. Outside the transparent aluminum walls, storms the size of continents raged in shades of ochre and bruised purple, a silent, chaotic ballet that mocked the unyielding order within the spire. For 20 years, Eris had made this journey, first as a junior attaché clutching a data slate with trembling hands, now as Earth's principal emissary, his hands resting calmly in his lap, the tremors long since buried in the cold, hard permafrost of his resolve. The mission was always the same to beg. He was a professional beggar, representing a species of beggars. He came to the conquered, the ancient, unblinking bureaucracy that governed the known galaxy, to plead for humanity's future, a future the Concord had placed in a cage of benevolent paternalism. Earth was a recovering addict, and the Concord was its self-appointed warden. 2 centuries ago, humanity had nearly torn itself apart in the resource wars, a final, planetary spasm of consumption and self-loathing that left the homeworld scarred, its biosphere wheezing, its population decimated. The Concord had arrived then, not as conquerors, but as saviors, their vast, silent ships eclipsing the wounded sky. They brought stability, medicine, and order. In exchange, they took everything else under the preservation mandate. Earth was quarantined, a living monument to a species failure. Humanity was forbidden from interstellar expansion, its technological development capped. Its children taught a sanitized history in which the Concord's arrival was an act of salvation, not opportunistic colonization. But the children were still hungry. The planet was still dying, slowly, inexorably. The water was clean, but it was rationed. The air was breathable, but it tasted of regret. The last, flickering ember of hope was Mars. For 57 years, humanity had petitioned for a seeding permit, the right to terraform their celestial neighbor, to build a second home, a new lung for a suffocating species. 57 times, the Concord had denied them, citing humanity's inherent emotional volatility and the unpredictable nature of Terran ambition. Today would be the 58th appeal, the final appeal. The capsule docked with a whisper of equalizing pressure. The doors hissed open into the Grand Chancellery antechamber, a cavernous space carved from the spire's core. Light, soft, and diffused, emanated from the walls themselves, illuminating delegates from 100 worlds. Gelatinous beings from the Cygnus arm pulsed in contemplative silence. Insectoid merchants from the rim chittered over trade futures, and towering sentinels from the Polarian axis stood immobile, their thoughts a closed circuit. They all gave Aris the same look, a fleeting glance of pity mixed with the faintest curl of disdain. He was the man from the broken planet, the representative of the Galactic charity case. He ignored them, his gaze fixed on the towering archway that led to the Chancellery proper. He smoothed the front of his simple gray tunic, the traditional diplomatic attire of Earth, a stark contrast to the shimmering energy fields and elaborate exoskeletons around him. The humility was a costume, a role he had perfected over 2 decades. Today, he would give his final performance. A soft chime echoed through the hall, and the great doors slid open. He walked into the heart of power, a circular chamber so vast its ceiling was lost in a manufactured starfield. In the center, on a raised dais, floated the Concord's architects, the Proctors. They were Signian, an ancient species of pure energy contained within intricate, crystalline shells that refracted the starlight into 1,000 shimmering rainbows. They communicated through modulated frequencies that were translated into a calm, impossibly resonant voice that filled the chamber without a source. Presiding was Proctor Valerius Kyle, his crystalline form a flawless, intricate lattice of light and geometry. He had been Proctor for 500 years. He had personally signed the last 12 denials of the Mars seeding permit. His presence was absolute, his calm eternal, his judgment as immutable as gravity. Emissary Thorn. The voice of Kale resonated, a sound like falling snow and grinding glaciers. You have requested an audience. The Concord listens. Aris stepped into the designated speaking circle, the floor beneath his feet cool and smooth as polished bone. He felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes, the pressure of a verdict already written. He began his speech, the familiar words flowing from him with the practiced cadence of a funeral rite. He spoke of rising sea levels on Earth, of population density reaching critical thresholds, of the psychological toll of living on a planet that felt more like a prison than a home. He presented new data, fresh projections, a comprehensive 17-year study on the long-term viability of the human genome in a closed system. He laid his people's suffering bare, offering it up as evidence, as an appeal to the logic and compassion the Concord claimed to embody. He kept his voice steady, tinged with a weariness that was not entirely feigned. He sounded like a man on the verge of collapse, a man whose hope had been worn down to a single, fraying thread. The proctors floated, their light pulsing in a slow, meditative rhythm. The other delegates shifted, some whispering to their aides, others simply waiting for the inevitable conclusion. They had seen this drama play out before, the desperate human, the patient proctors, the predictable, sorrowful denial. When he finished, a profound silence filled the chamber. It stretched for a long, deliberate minute, a calculated display of the Concord's unhurried authority. Finally, Kyle's voice returned, softer now, dripping with a sympathy that was more insulting than any rebuke. We have considered your words. Emissary Thorn, we have reviewed your data. The Concord's primary function is to ensure cosmic stability, to prevent the echoes of past calamities from repeating. Humanity's history is a symphony of such calamities. The Proctor's light shifted to a deep, soothing blue. Your species is brilliant, passionate, and resilient, but that passion is a fire that has, time and again, burned your own house down. To grant you a new world now would be akin to giving a pyromaniac a box of matches. It would be irresponsible. For your own good, and for the stability of this galactic sector, the 58th request for the Mars seeding permit is, with regret, denied. The words hung in the air, final and absolute. A quiet murmur rippled through the delegates. It was over. The performance was complete. Eris Thorn stood in the center of the room, his head bowed slightly. He did not move. He did not speak. The silence thickened. Kale was about to dismiss him when Eris looked up. And, for the first time, a subtle shift occurred in the vast chamber's atmosphere. The weariness in Aris's eyes was gone. The desperation in his posture had vanished. He stood straighter, and a chilling, unnerving calm settled over him. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Proctor Kyle," he said, his voice no longer pleading, but crisp, clear, and resonant with a strange finality. "Your clarity is appreciated. It confirms our final contingency assessment." Kale's light flickered, an almost subliminal sign of surprise. "Contingency? Emissary?" "Yeah," Eris said, his eyes scanning the chamber, meeting the gaze of the other delegates, one by one. "A plan for the inevitable outcome of this meeting. You see, we have been studying you as well, not just your laws and your traditions, but your philosophy. The Conquered values stability above all else. A closed loop, no variables. Humanity has always been an unwelcome variable. You are never going to let us out of our cage." He took a step forward, out of the designated circle, a shocking breach of protocol that sent a wave of tense energy through the room. "You speak of our histories, Proctor. Let us speak of yours. Specifically, of the tribute of penance levied against Earth after the Concord's establishment of the preservation mandate." He paused, letting the words sink in. "A decade ago, as a sign of our subservience and to prove we could contribute to the galactic good, Earth was commissioned to design and build 100 Genesis probes. Do you recall?" An aide next to Kale murmured, and a holographic display flickered to life beside the proctor, showing the schematics of a sleek silver probe. "The project was a success," Kale's voice stated, a hint of suspicion now coloring its perfect resonance. "Ecological reclamation devices. They were distributed to several member worlds to help repair minor industrial damage, a fine example of humanity's potential when properly guided." "Indeed," Aris said, his smile widening slightly. "Their stated function was to atomize contaminants and resequence damaged biomes using sophisticated nanite swarms, restoring worlds to a pristine, natural state. A noble purpose. We were, as you say, properly guided. But we humans have a talent for architecture. Proctor, we build layers, redundancies. The Genesis probes had a secondary function, a dormant protocol buried so deep in their core programming that not even your most advanced scans could detect it. A failsafe, if you will." He began to pace slowly, his voice dropping, becoming a storyteller in a room of gods. "We called it the Lethe Protocol." Lethe, from an old Earth myth, was a river in the underworld. Those who drank from it experienced complete forgetfulness. Our protocol is similar. It doesn't restore a world, Proctor. It makes it forget it was ever alive. The nanites don't just clean, they deconstruct. They break down complex organic matter, revert soil to sterile silicate dust, unravel atmospheres into their base, unbreathable elements. It is a slow, quiet, and irreversible process, a Genesis cascade that unwinds a biosphere back to its primordial, lifeless state. It doesn't burn worlds, it unmakes them. The chamber was utterly silent now. The delegates were frozen, their attention locked on the small, gray-clad human who spoke of unmaking worlds with the detached air of a lecturer. Kyle's crystalline form began to glow with a brighter, sharper light, a clear sign of agitation. This is an outrageous and empty threat. Emissary, your species lacks the capacity for such an undertaking. Oh, it's not a threat. Aris corrected him gently. A threat is a promise of future action. This is a report on a current event. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the glowing form of the proctor. Of the 100 probes we delivered, 5 were of a special design. 5 were deployed not to developing worlds with minor industrial damage, but to the 5 founding homeworlds of the Galactic Concord. They have been in stable, geosynchronous orbit for 9 standard years, performing their reclamation duties, becoming a part of the background noise of your planetary defense grids. One of them is, at this very moment, orbiting your homeworld. Cygnus Prime. A collective gasp. A chorus of clicks and telepathic shrieks echoed through the chamber. Technicians in observation booths above began working frantically, their fingers flying across consoles. On the large holoscreen, orbital maps of 5 different star systems appeared. Cygnus Prime, Polaria, Ventus, Hylar, Cathar, the 5 pillars of the Concord. The Lethe protocol required a specific, complex quantum-entangled activation key. Eris continued, his voice as calm as the void. A signal that could not be faked, blocked, or traced. It was keyed to the unique biosignature of Earth's principal emissary, linked to my own vital signs. The trigger was a specific neurological response, the profound and final acceptance of despair. The very feeling your verdict was engineered to produce in me. The activation signal was sent the instant you spoke the word denied. The technician's frantic work paid off. Data streams flashed across the holoscreen. Red alerts began to blink over the orbital paths of the 5 homeworlds. Confirmed anomalous energy signature. Class 7. Nanite swarm deployment. Protocol unknown. The chamber erupted. Delegates scrambled from their seats. Shouts in a dozen languages filled the air. But above it all, Eris Thorne's voice cut through the chaos, cold and clear as breaking glass. The Genesis Cascade has begun. Our projections estimate that in approximately 72 standard hours, the atmospheric composition of your worlds will become critical. In a week, the soil will be sterile. In a month, the oceans will be acid. You spoke of wisdom, Proctor. We learned ours in the dirt and the ash of a dying world. We learned that a species with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous variable in the universe. The reclamation of your worlds has started. You wished to preserve us. Now, you will join us. He stood alone in the center of the pandemonium, no longer a beggar, no longer a victim. He was a historian, and he had just written the galaxy's final chapter. The chaos that erupted in the Grand Chancellery was not the wild, panicked screaming of a mob. It was the sharp, percussive implosion of an empire's self-assurance. For millennia, the Galactic Concord had operated on a plane of existence above crisis. They managed calamities. They mediated disasters. But they were never the victims. Now, victimhood was a virus spreading through the chamber's sterile air. Delegates transmitted frantic, encrypted messages to their homeworlds. Aides collapsed into their chairs, their respiratory functions spasming in shock. Towering Polarian sentinels, silent guards who hadn't moved in a century, suddenly activated. their armored plates shifting with a low hum as they created a cordon around the chamber's exits, their multifaceted eyes glowing a menacing crimson. The spire was now a cage, and everyone was trapped inside with the man who held the key. Eris Thorn did not resist when two of the sentinels approached him. Their movements were fluid, impossibly fast, their metallic limbs extending to bracket him without touching him. There was no need for force. He had nowhere to go, and his part in the physical act was over. His body was now just a container for the galaxy's most valuable bargaining chip, the knowledge of how, or if, the Genesis cascade could be stopped. As he was escorted from the chamber, he caught one last glimpse of Proctor Valerius Kale. The Proctor's crystalline form was glowing with a furious, white-hot intensity, the serene light of a nebula having collapsed into the rage of a supernova. For the first time in 500 years, the architect of cosmic stability looked entirely, irrevocably unstable. Aris was placed not in a prison, but in an observation chamber, a room that was itself a weapon of psychological warfare. The walls were a soft, uniform white, seamless, and featureless, designed to induce sensory deprivation. There was no furniture, only a low dais in the center that hummed with a subtle, unnerving vibration. The air was the same perfectly engineered mixture, but now it felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the Concord's absolute control over his immediate environment, a stark contrast to the utter lack of control they now had over their own fate. He sat on the dais, closed his eyes, and regulated his breathing. The frantic energy of the chancellery faded, replaced by a profound, hollow calm. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, lived through 1,000,000 simulations of its aftermath. He had accepted his own death as a prerequisite for the plan's inception. What he felt now was not fear or triumph, but the quiet, crushing weight of consequence. He was no longer a man. He was an event, a historical inflection point, and the gravity of it threatened to pull him apart. The wall in front of him shimmered, becoming a transparent screen. On the other side stood Proctor Kale, alone. The furious glow had subsided, replaced by a cold, controlled luminescence. He had reassumed the mask of authority, but the cracks were visible in the slight tremor of the light patterns across his crystalline shell. "This is madness, Thorn." Kale's voice resonated, stripped of its paternalistic warmth, now flat and hard as diamond, a gesture of pure nihilism. "You will not save your people. You have only damned them to an extinction even we could not have imagined." "Extinction is a slow process, Proctor," Eris replied, his voice even. "We've been living it for 2 centuries. We've just shared the experience. There is a deactivation protocol," Call stated, not a question, but a demand. "A weapon of this sophistication must have a fail-safe. You will give it to us." Eris allowed a small, tired smile. "There is no us anymore, Kyle. There is you, the representative of a dying coalition, and there is me, the representative of a species that is tired of asking for permission to survive, and I will give you nothing. This is not a negotiation where you make demands. This is a hostage situation, and the lives of 5 worlds are on the table. My world is not one of them." Kyle's light flickered violently. "What do you want? The Mars permit, it's yours. Take the whole damn system. Is that what this is about? A petulant child burning down the house because he was denied a toy." "A toy?" Eris's voice grew cold. "Mars was never just a planet. It was a symbol. It was the future you dangled in front of us while you shackled our present. You think this is about a ball of red rock. This is about the chains. This is about the preservation mandate. He stood up, walking slowly toward the transparent wall, his reflection a pale ghost against the proctor's shimmering form. My demand is simple. The Concord will publicly and permanently dissolve the preservation mandate. All technological and expansionist restrictions placed upon humanity are to be lifted, effective immediately. All Concord redacted data on human history, technology, and genetics is to be transferred to our archives, unedited. Earth and its sovereign territories are to be recognized as an independent, Tier 1 power, with all the rights and privileges that entails. You will not guide us. You will not observe us. You will leave us alone, forever. The sheer audacity of the demand left Kyle silent. Aris was not asking for a concession. He was demanding a complete abdication of the Concord's founding principle. The mandate was the cornerstone of their philosophy that advanced civilizations had a duty to protect the galaxy from the volatile ambitions of younger, less stable species like humanity. To dissolve it would be to admit their entire worldview was a failure. You ask us to unravel the very fabric of galactic stability, Kyle finally said, his voice a low hum of disbelief. To unleash your species' ambition, as you call it. We have seen what that ambition leads to. You have seen what our ambition leads to when we are starving, Aris countered. You have no idea what we can achieve when we are free, and frankly, you have lost the moral authority to judge. Your stability was a lie, a carefully curated piece built on the slow suffocation of any species you deemed inconvenient. You are not shepherds, Kyle. You are zookeepers. He placed his hand on the cool surface of the wall. Those are my terms. You have 71 hours left to consider them. The screen went white, and Aris was alone again. He knew Kyle wouldn't agree. Not yet. The Concord was an ancient organism, and its reflexes were slow. It would have to exhaust every other possibility before it would even consider surrender. He had accounted for that. In another part of the spire, a frantic energy buzzed in the Concord's primary science and threat assessment nexus. The galaxy's greatest minds, beings of silicon, energy, and carbon, worked in a desperate symphony to understand the Lethe protocol. A direct feed from Cygnus Prime played on the central holoscreen. The image was deceptively peaceful. It showed a wide, placid river, the legendary Waters of Kale, winding through a forest of crystalline flora that chimed softly in the alien breeze. But as they watched, a grayness started at the river's edge, a creeping, unnatural blight. It wasn't decay, it was erasure. The water didn't become murky, it simply ceased to be water, its complex hydrogen bonds unraveling, leaving behind a fine, sterile dust that the wind carried away like ash. The crystalline trees at the water's edge began to lose their luster, their intricate structures becoming brittle, then crumbling into silicate powder. The soft chiming ceased. A Sinian scientist, a being of pure energy, like Kale, but smaller, its shell, less ornate, transmitted its findings to the Emergency Council. The nanites are not an infection, its translated voice reported, filled with a sense of intellectual horror. They are a decompiler. They are unwriting the laws of biology at a molecular level. They are using the planet's own biomass as fuel to replicate. It is elegant, flawless. We have no countermeasure. We have nothing in our databases that can even comprehend this level of targeted deconstruction. It is not an act of war. It is an act of philosophy. This report was being streamed live to the hastily reconvened Concord Council, a tense gathering of the most powerful species, now stripped of their ceremonial pomp. It was in this atmosphere of rising panic that a new voice asserted itself. General Vorlag of the Polarian Axis, a bipedal being encased in gunmetal gray armor that seemed fused to its chitinous body, slammed a gauntleted fist onto the central podium. The Polarians were the Concord's muscle, a martial race that had policed the Concord's borders for 1,000 years. They understood conflict not as a political failure, but as a necessary tool of cosmic hygiene. Philosophy. Vorlag's voice was a harsh, guttural rasp, like grinding metal. The human has released a biological plague upon our founding worlds, and you call it philosophy. This is terrorism. The response must be swift and absolute. Proctor Kale floated at the head of the assembly, his light a troubled, pulsing violet. The human holds the deactivation key. General, an attack on his homeworld would guarantee the destruction of our own. He is bluffing, Vorlag countered, his multifaceted eyes sweeping the room. He would not sacrifice his own planet. Are you certain? Kale asked quietly. He has already sacrificed his own life. This is a man who has calculated his species' extinction and found it preferable to continued subjugation. He is not operating on a plane of logic you or I can easily grasp. He is driven by 2 centuries of desperation. Then we must be driven by millennia of resolve, Vorlag retorted, stepping forward. We are the conquered. We do not negotiate with terrorists. We do not bow to the threats of a failed, primitive species. There is another option. A final option. He activated a tactical display above the podium. It showed the Sol system, with Earth a tiny blue marble. The human has created a simple equation, 5 of our worlds for the freedom of his one. I propose we reject his terms and offer our own. The display zoomed in on Earth, and a web of targeting reticles blanketed the planet. We initiate Protocol Omega, the complete and utter sterilization of planet Earth and all its orbital habitats. We will turn their world to glass. Nay, we will fracture their moon into a debris field. We will salt their ashes with radiation so that nothing ever grows there again. We will erase them from the cosmic record. A wave of shocked silence washed over the council. Several delegates recoiled. The Hylar ambassador, a fragile bird-like creature, let out a soft cry of distress. But our worlds, General, it chirped. Cygnus Prime, Polaria itself. They will be lost, Vorlag stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. A tragic, but necessary sacrifice. We are leaders. We are tasked with making the hard choices. We weigh the loss of 5 worlds, our most sacred and ancient homes, against the future contamination of 5,000 worlds by an unchecked, unchained humanity. The math is simple. The human variable has proven too volatile. The experiment has failed. The time has come to cleanse the laboratory. He looked directly at Kale, a clear challenge in his glowing red eyes. We can die on our knees, begging a human for mercy, or we can die on our feet, ensuring that this abomination of a species never threatens another child of the conquered again. The choice is clear. Erase the human anomaly. In his sterile white room, Eris Thorne watched the live feed of the council meeting on the wall. He saw the shock, the horror, and the terrifying, cold logic on the faces of the delegates as they considered Vorlog's final solution. He had planned for their fear, their anger, their desperation. He had not fully planned for them to be willing to commit suicide in order to murder him. The Genesis cascade had been a key to a cage. He was now realizing it might also be the trigger for a mutual execution. The silence in the Concord Council chamber following General Vorlag's proposal was heavier than the gravity of a neutron star. It was the silence of a civilization staring into an abyss of its own making. Vorlag's Omega Protocol was not just a military strategy. It was an ideological last stand. It was the ultimate expression of the Concord's core belief that the preservation of galactic order, their order, was a principle so absolute that it was worth sacrificing their own creators. The thought of their 5 sacred homeworlds, the cradles of their respective species, being unmade by a silent, creeping plague was horrifying. But the thought of humanity, raw, wounded, and now armed with a righteous fury, unleashed upon the galaxy was, to hardliners like Vorlag, a far greater horror. One was an ending. The other was the beginning of an unpredictable and terrifying new age. Proctor Kale, the embodiment of the Concord's measured, paternalistic philosophy, felt the foundations of his 500-year reign cracking beneath him. He was a creature of logic and precedent, but the human had thrown the rulebook into a star. Aris Thorn was not a variable. He was a singularity, a point at which the known laws of political physics ceased to apply. Kyle watched the delegates, saw the conflict in their eyes, the subtle shift as Vorlog's brutal logic began to take root in the fertile soil of their fear. He knew he was losing control. The Concord, for the first time in its existence, was truly on the verge of splintering. Back in his featureless white cell, Eris felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The feed from the council meeting played on, a live broadcast of his own potential eulogy. He had wagered that the Concord's self-preservation instinct would outweigh their arrogance. Vorlog was calling his bluff with a starship aimed at his planet's heart. Eris had prepared for his own death, but the thought of Earth, of the billions of souls ignorant of the cosmic chess game being played for their existence, being extinguished in a flash of retaliatory fire, was a weight he had not allowed himself to fully bear until now. His was the ultimate gamble, and he had just seen his opponent push the entire galaxy's worth of chips into the center of the table. He had 70 hours. The clock was ticking not just for the Concord's worlds, but for his own. He needed to change the equation. The walls shimmered again. It was not Kyle this time. The transparent screen revealed a different figure. A female of a species Eris had only read about in restricted archives, a Cathar. She was tall and slender, her skin the color of polished obsidian, with faint, bioluminescent patterns pulsing beneath its surface like captured constellations. Her face was strikingly humanoid, but elongated, with large, silver eyes that held an unnerving stillness. She was dressed in the simple and noise dark robes of a Concord archivist. Her name, the display beside her identified, was Lyra. "Emissary Thorn," she said, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to absorb the sound in the room rather than project it. "I am the chief archivist for the Cathar delegation. My homeworld is one of the 5 currently under the influence of your Lethe protocol." "I'm aware," Aris said, his tone cautious. He had expected interrogators, generals, perhaps another appeal from Kyle. An archivist was an unexpected variable. I have been studying the redacted history of your species since your arrival, Lyra continued, her silver eyes unblinking. The Concord's official record is incomplete. It paints a picture of a race of self-destructive children who must be kept in a planetary nursery for their own safety. But the raw data, the pre-mandate intercept logs, the uncensored reports from the first contact teams, they tell a different story. She paused, her gaze intense. They tell the story of a species that reaches for the heavens, even as it drowns in the mud. A species that composes symphonies in the midst of plagues and writes poetry on the walls of its prisons. You are not just volatile, emissary. You are pathologically, irrationally, beautifully resilient. And General Vorlag is about to erase all of that because he is incapable of understanding it. He seems to understand it well enough to want to destroy it, Eris countered, a note of bitterness in his voice. He does not understand, Lyra corrected gently. He fears. Fear is the enemy of understanding. I, on the other hand, am a historian. It is my function to understand, which is why I believe you have a countermeasure to the Omega Protocol. It was not a question. Her stillness was a form of pressure, a quiet certainty that was more disarming than any threat. The Genesis Cascade was your shield. You would not have come here with a shield and no sword. You knew the Concord's first instinct would be to threaten your homeworld. You planned for it. You have a weapon, emissary, a deterrent, something that prevents them from simply calling your bluff and sacrificing their 5 worlds for the prize of your annihilation. Tell me what it is. Eris stared at her, his mind racing. She was right. He had come with a sword, a weapon so terrible, so final, that he had prayed he would never have to unsheath it. It was a secret kept not just from the conquered, but from his own people. It was a plan known only to him and a small, fanatically loyal team of scientists and engineers buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice, a group who called themselves Project Chimera. Even if such a thing existed, Eris said slowly, why would I reveal it to you? Your world is dying because of me. My world is dying because of the conquered, Lyra replied without hesitation. They planted the seeds of your desperation for 2 centuries. They are reaping the harvest they sowed. I am not interested in saving the conquered. I am interested in preventing a galactic dark age. Vorlag's protocol will not just destroy Earth. It will shatter the conquered into 1,000 warring factions. The Polarians will seize power. The merchants will form their own cartels. The pacifist species will be devoured. The stability you have shattered will be replaced by a century of bloodshed. Your freedom will be born into a galaxy at war. That is a future that serves no one. Her silver eyes seemed to glow with a faint, internal light. Whatever you are holding in reserve, emissary, it is time to reveal it. The council is about to vote. Vorlag has the momentum. Eris looked at the archivist, at the strange, quiet intelligence in her eyes. He saw no deception, only a profound, weary understanding of the cycles of history. He had come here to break a cycle, not to begin a new one of devastation. He had one last card to play. It was a card he hoped would make them fold, not call. He nodded slowly. Patch me through to the council chamber. Live. All frequencies. Lyra's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. She touched a control on her side of the wall. And a moment later, Iris Thorne's face appeared on the main holoscreen in the Conquered Council, looming over the stunned delegates. His voice, calm and controlled, filled the chamber. "General Vorlag," he began, his eyes seeming to lock with the Polarians across the void. "I commend you on your conviction. Your willingness to sacrifice your own homeworld for the sake of your principles is admirable. It is the kind of hard choice we humans understand all too well. However, you are operating under a false assumption. You believe this is a choice between your 5 worlds and my one. You are mistaken." He let the silence hang for a beat before continuing. "The Genesis probes you know about were our shield. But we did not come unprotected. We also deployed a sword. While Earth was building your reclamation devices, we were also engaged in a clandestine project of our own. We built a series of deep space observatories, ostensibly to monitor stellar drift and dark matter fluctuations. The Concord even praised the initiative, citing it as another example of humanity's harmless scientific curiosity." A new image appeared on the screen next to Eris's face. It showed a small, unassuming space station, all spindly arms and sensor dishes, drifting in the void. "This is Observatory Delta 7 located in the Oort cloud of your own Polarian system. It looks like a telescope, but its primary function is not to look, but to listen. It is a quantum resonance scanner keyed to the unique energy signature of Polarian hyperdrive cores. It can detect and lock onto every single Polarian military vessel in the galaxy in real time, no matter where it is." Vorlag's armored form went rigid. "What is the meaning of this, human?" "The meaning, General, is that we know where your children sleep," Aris said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "These observatories are not just scanners. They are delivery systems. Each one contains a single payload, not a bomb, not a missile, something far more personal. We call them specter coils. They are quantum-entangled reality projectors. When activated, the coil in the observatory doesn't fire a weapon. It instantaneously projects a micro-singularity, no larger than a grain of sand, directly into the hyperdrive core of every ship it is targeting." The screen shifted, now showing a simulation. A fleet of Polarian warships, represented by red icons, blinked out of existence simultaneously. There was no explosion, no flash. They were simply gone, their matter compressed into a point of infinite density and erased from space-time. It is instantaneous, unblockable, and absolute. There is no defense, no warning. Your entire fleet, your entire instrument of control and intimidation would cease to exist in the same nanosecond. He let the horrifying reality of his words settle into the chamber. "You threaten to turn my world to glass, General, and in response, I am offering you this assurance if a single Concord warship makes a hostile move toward the Sol system. If you so much as power up your weapons, my final order will be transmitted. And the Polarian Axis, your entire species' military might, your legacy as the galaxy's enforcers, will become a footnote in a history book written by me. I will not just kill your fleet, General, I will delete it." He looked from Vorlag to Kyle, and then to the rest of the terrified assembly. This has never been a negotiation about 5 worlds. It has been a negotiation about all of them. The Lethe Protocol was the disease. The Spectre Coils are the cure. My terms stand. Dissolve the mandate. Recognize our sovereignty. Leave us alone. The clock is still ticking." He finished, and his image vanished from the screen, leaving behind a silence more profound and more terrible than any before it. The delegates stared at General Vorlag, whose armored form was trembling, not with rage, but with the dawning, horrific understanding that the human hadn't just built a better cage, he had built a better god. The revelation of the specter coils shattered the last vestiges of conquered authority. It was a strategic masterstroke, a move so audacious and so terrifyingly elegant that it transcended the mere act of war and became an act of existential redefinition. General Vorlag, the avatar of Polarian might, stood frozen on the council podium, his ironclad certainty reduced to slag. The human hadn't just threatened his fleet, he had threatened his species' very identity. The Polarians were their ships, their power, their culture, their place in the galactic hierarchy. It was all forged in the hyperdrive cores that Eris Thorn now held hostage with a word, the Omega Protocol. Once a symbol of the Concord's ultimate power, was now revealed for what it was, a rusty blade held by a man whose opponent was aiming a particle beam at his heart. The vote was no longer a consideration. The debate was over. The bluff had been called, and the Concord's hand was empty. Proctor Kekel, in that moment, felt the weight of 1,000 years of history settle upon his shimmering form. He had presided over an era of unprecedented peace, a carefully manicured garden of stability. But he now understood that the garden was a greenhouse, and the glass had just been shattered by the very plant they had sought to contain. He looked at Vorlag, at the stunned delegates, and he knew the Concord was finished, not by the Genesis cascade, but by the simple, undeniable truth that their power had always been an illusion, maintained only as long as no one was desperate enough to call it into question. Humanity, in its 2-century-long agony, had become that desperate. Kale's light softened from a panicked violet to a deep, melancholic blue, the color of a dying star. He raised one crystalline limb, a gesture that commanded silence. The human's terms will be met. He resonated, his voice devoid of its usual resonance, now thin and brittle as ancient ice. Draft the accord. The preservation mandate is dissolved. In his white chamber, Eris watched the proceedings with a profound and hollow sense of victory. He felt no elation, no surge of triumph. He felt only the immense, crushing gravity of the future he had just unleashed. He had won. Earth was free, but he had won by holding a gun to the head of the galaxy, and he knew that such victories are never clean. They leave scars, not just on the vanquished, but on the victor. Lyra, the Cathar archivist, appeared at the transparent wall again. The faint, knowing smile had returned to her lips. "A brilliant move, emissary," she whispered. "You did not just defeat them. You dismantled them. They can never go back to what they were." "And what do we become?" Eris asked, his voice weary. "Monsters the new bullies on the galactic stage. That is the question, isn't it?" Lyra replied, her silver eyes thoughtful. "History is a pendulum, emissary. It swings from one extreme to the other. You have just given it a very powerful push. Where it settles will depend on what your people do with this freedom you have purchased for them at such a terrible price." She paused. "There is one final matter, the Genesis cascade. Proctor Kale will demand the deactivation sequence as a condition of his surrender." "There is no deactivation sequence," Eris said quietly, the confession feeling like a physical weight in his chest. That was the one lie. The Lethe Protocol, once activated, is irreversible. The nanites are self-replicating, self-sustaining. They can't be stopped. Lyra's smile did not falter. If anything, it deepened with a strange, almost imperceptible sadness. "I know," she said. "I read the unredacted technical schematics an hour ago. The ones you leaked into our public archives a moment before revealing your Spectre coils. A very clever bit of psychological warfare. You forced them to discover the truth for themselves, to feel the finality of their loss before they could even ask for a reprieve. It made their surrender absolute." She looked at him, her gaze piercing. 5 worlds are going to die. Eris Thorn, 5 cradles of civilization will be rendered barren. That is the price of your victory. Can you live with that? Eris turned away from her, unable to meet that knowing, ancient gaze. "I can live with it better than I can live with the slow death of my own world," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The Concord made the choice for me when they signed our death warrant 200 years ago. This is just the echo of that decision." The signing of the Thorn Accord was a surreal, somber affair. It took place in the Grand Chancellery, the same room where Eris had once stood as a beggar. Now, he stood as a conqueror, though he wore no crown and felt no pride. The delegates of the 5 founding worlds, including a shattered and silent General Vorlag, signed the document with movements that were heavy with defeat. Proctor Kyle was the last to sign, his energy form transmitting the final, binding digital signature that officially ended a galactic era. The Concord was no more. In its place was a loose coalition of sovereign systems, a name that rang hollow with the unspoken truth that there was now only one true power in the sector, the species that held the galaxy's kill switch. As part of the Accord, the Spectre coils would remain active but dormant, a permanent deterrent, a constant reminder of humanity's new status. They were the price of peace. Eris Thorn was released, and he made the long, lonely journey back down the spire, the transport capsule descending through the violent, beautiful storms of Xylos, a fitting metaphor for the future he was returning to. News of the Thorn Accord hit Earth like a tidal wave. For 2 centuries, humanity had lived under a cloud of quiet despair, a managed decline. Now, the sun had broken through. There were celebrations in the overcrowded arcologies of what was once Europe, joyful riots in the floating cities of the Pacific, and stunned, tearful silence in the deep earth habitats beneath the scarred North American continent. Eris Thorn was a hero, a savior, a name whispered with the reverence once reserved for mythical gods. But Eris, upon his return, did not participate in the celebrations. He sequestered himself, along with the architects of Project Chimera and the Lethe Protocol, in the Antarctic Deep Earth Facility. Winterhold. He knew the hardest part was not winning the war, but surviving the peace. The galaxy was watching. They were not watching with admiration, but with a fearful, resentful curiosity. They were waiting to see what the prisoners would do now that they had stormed the warden's office. The first years of freedom were a chaotic, euphoric explosion of human ambition. With the Concord's technological shackles removed, centuries of suppressed innovation burst forth. Work on the Mars Terraforming Project, Project Dawn, began immediately, with massive atmospheric processors and seeding ships constructed at a speed that stunned the rest of the galaxy. New propulsion systems, long suppressed medical technologies, and advancements in AI and quantum computing were unveiled seemingly overnight. Humanity was stretching its legs for the first time in generations, and the sheer, raw energy of it was both magnificent and terrifying. But beneath the surface of this new renaissance, fault lines began to appear. Freedom, Aris discovered, was a more complex and dangerous force than oppression. Oppression had unified them in their suffering. Freedom was beginning to divide them in their ambition. Factions began to form. There were the expansionists, led by a charismatic industrialist named Marcus Valerius, who argued that humanity had a right, a duty, to claim its place amongst the stars, to colonize new worlds and build a human empire to rival the old conquered. They saw the specter coils not as a deterrent, but as a mandate, a tool of manifest destiny. Opposing them were the isolationists, a faction of scientists and philosophers who argued that humanity should focus on healing Earth and Mars, that they should turn inward and prove they could manage their own house before they started building new ones. They warned that unchecked expansion would only lead them to repeat the mistakes of their past. And in the shadows, a third faction was growing. They were a disparate group of former intelligence operatives, black ops soldiers, and political dissidents who had been hardened and radicalized by the long struggle against the Concord. They called themselves Apex, and their philosophy was simple and brutal. Humanity was not just another species, it was superior. The Concord had suppressed them not because they were volatile, but because the Concord knew that a free humanity would inevitably dominate. Apex believed that the specter coils were not enough. True security, they argued, would only come when all potential rivals were neutralized. They were not interested in building an empire. They were interested in culling the garden. Eris Thorn, the man who had freed them all, found himself in the impossible position of trying to mediate between these burgeoning ideologies. He argued for a third way, a path of measured expansion, of cautious exploration coupled with a deep and abiding focus on rebuilding their homeworld and their culture. But his voice, once the catalyst for galactic revolution, was now just one among many. He was a hero of a war that was already fading into myth. The new generation, born into freedom, did not see the specter coils as a terrible necessity. They saw them as an inheritance, a birthright. The celebrations were over. The power struggles had begun. The future of humanity and the galaxy would be decided not in a silent standoff with an alien empire, but in a loud, fractious, and potentially bloody debate among themselves. Eris had opened Pandora's box, and he was beginning to fear that he had no idea how to close it. The ghost of the Concord was dead, but the ghost of humanity's own destructive nature was very much alive. The pendulum of history, as Lyra had warned, did not settle in the center. It swung with a violent, terrifying momentum toward the very extremism Eris had fought to escape. The first casualty of freedom was unity. The euphoria of the Thorn Accord curdled into a bitter brew of factionalism and paranoia. Marcus Valerius's expansionists, funded by a new generation of industrialists growing rich off liberated technologies, painted a glorious vision of a human stellar empire, a Sol ascendant, where the tragedies of old Earth would be redeemed by the conquest of new frontiers. Their rhetoric was intoxicating, a siren song of destiny and power that resonated deeply with a species long defined by its limitations. On the other side, the isolationists were increasingly painted as cowards, as Concord sympathizers who lacked the vision to seize the future. And in the growing schism between them, Apex found its fertile ground. They operated in the shadows, a cancer metastasizing within the new body politic. They didn't hold rallies. They orchestrated accidents. They didn't publish manifestos. They leaked doctored intelligence reports that stoked fear and suspicion of alien species, painting the fledgling coalition of sovereign systems not as a collection of defeated states, but as a gathering conspiracy, biding its time for revenge. Eris Thorn, the architect of their liberty, became a man adrift in the storm he had created. He was a figurehead, a living monument, but he held no official power. He had refused all titles, believing that his role as a revolutionary was over. He had hoped to be a conscience, a guide. Instead, he became an obstacle. His calls for caution and measured progress were drowned out by the drums of expansion and the whispers of Apex's paranoia. He watched as the Mars terraforming project, Project Dawn, once a symbol of hope and survival, was transformed into a military staging ground. The first cities built on the Red Planet were not scientific biomes and civilian habitats, but sprawling naval shipyards and barracks, churning out a new generation of warships under the justification of proactive defense. The Spectre coils, the ultimate deterrent, were no longer seen as a shield to be kept in reserve, but as the foundation upon which an aggressive new foreign policy could be built. Humanity had not just been freed from its cage, it had begun to admire the bars. The tipping point came with the Xylos incident, a human prospecting vessel operating in violation of newly established territorial boundaries was damaged by a Polarian patrol ship, the remnants of their fleet, now serving as a meager policing force for the coalition. The incident was minor, a collision resulting from a navigational error, with no casualties. But in the fevered atmosphere on Earth and Mars, Apex and the expansionists spun it into an act of unprovoked aggression, a test of humanity's resolve. Valerius went on the public networks, his face a mask of righteous fury, demanding retribution. For 2 centuries, we bowed to them, he thundered, his voice echoing in every arcology and Martian habitat. Are we to bow still? Do we allow the shadows of our former masters to harass our people in our own backyard? The time for humility is over. The time for strength is now. The public outcry was deafening. Eris pleaded for calm, for an impartial investigation, but his voice was a whisper in a hurricane. Under immense public pressure, the newly formed Earth Prime Council, heavily influenced by Valerius's faction, issued an ultimatum to the Polarian government: formally apologize, cede the entire Xylos sector, and disarm the remainder of your fleet, or face the consequences. It was the language of the old conquered, the arrogance of absolute power, and Eris felt a chilling sense of historical irony. They had become the thing they had sworn to destroy. The Polarians, proud and broken, refused, and the Council, in a secret session, voted to activate the Spectre coils. Eris was informed of the decision not as a consultant, but as a courtesy. He had 1 hour. He raced to Winterhold, the Antarctic facility, the only place from which the final activation order could be transmitted. He found himself in the cold, sterile command center, the same room from which he had once held a galaxy hostage to save his people. Now, he was there to save them from themselves. Facing him across the central console was General Eva Rostova, the new commander of Project Chimera, a hard-faced woman who had been a junior officer during the standoff with the Conquered. She saw Eris not as a savior, but as a relic. The order is confirmed, Dr. Thorn, she said. her voice devoid of emotion. "It is the will of the Council." "It is the will of a mob," Eris countered, his hands gripping the edge of the console. "You can't do this. Ava, this isn't defense. This is an execution. You will not just be destroying their fleet, you will be starting a war we cannot win. Not a war of ships, but a war of hatred. The entire galaxy will unite against us, and they will be right to do so." "The galaxy is weak," Rostova said dismissively. "We hold the only weapon that matters. Fear is a more effective form of governance than any treaty." "Is that what we've become?" Eris asked, his voice cracking with a despair deeper than any he had felt in the conquered spire. "The thing to be feared, we fought for the right to live, not the right to rule." He looked at the activation key, a simple biometric scanner that was keyed to his and Rostova's command signatures. "I will not authorize this. I will not be the man who trades our soul for an empire." Rostova's eyes narrowed. "Your authorization is a formality. The Council has granted me emergency override authority. Step aside. Doctor, your part in our history is over." Apex soldiers, clad in black armor, emerged from the shadows of the command center, their weapons raised. Eris was truly alone. He had won them their freedom, and they were now using it to hold a gun to his head. In that moment, surrounded by the very people he had saved, Eris Thorn made his final choice. He had one last contingency, one final desperate move in a game he had never wanted to play. He looked at the console, at the blinking lights that represented the lives of billions. "You're right, General," he said softly, a strange, tragic calm settling over him. "My part is over." With a speed that belied his age, he lunged for the console, not for the activation key, but for a small, unmarked panel on its side. He slammed his palm against it, and a new protocol flashed across the screen in blood-red letters: Chimera Fall. It was the system's ultimate failsafe, a program he had designed in secret with a handful of loyalists who feared this exact outcome. It was a digital ghost, a logic bomb buried in the heart of the Spectre coil network. It did not deactivate the coils. It repurposed them. The quantum resonance scanners in the deep space observatories instantly shifted their targeting parameters. They were no longer locked onto the Polarian fleet. They were locked onto every single human-made hyperdrive core built after the Thorn Accord. Every new warship churning out of the Martian shipyards, every expansionist freighter, every apex stealth cruiser, the entire infrastructure of humanity's new and aggressive expansion. Rostova stared in horror as the tactical display shifted, the web of targeting reticles now blanketing her own fleets. "What have you done?" she shrieked. "I have kept a promise," Aris said, his voice heavy with the weight of his actions. "I told the galaxy we would leave them alone. We, not just the Concord. The Chimera Fall protocol had one final function. Once its target retasking was complete, it initiated a complete data wipe of its own systems. The technology behind the Spectre coils, the science of the quantum singularities, the schematics, the research, all of it was being irretrievably erased from every database. In a matter of minutes, the ultimate weapon in the universe would become an unsolvable mystery. Humanity would still have its deterrent, but it could never again build a new one. The sword was being locked into its scabbard, and the key was being thrown away. Apex soldiers surged forward, but it was too late. The protocol was complete. Eris Thorn slumped against the console, the strength finally leaving him. He had saved the galaxy twice, once from the Concord, and once from humanity. fallout was immediate and immense. Marcus Valerius and the Apex leadership were exposed and disgraced. The war fever broke, replaced by a profound and humbling sense of shock. Humanity had been forced to stare into the abyss of its own hubris, and it had blinked. The years that followed were a time of quiet introspection. The Mars project was re-envisioned, the shipyards slowly converted into centers for ecological science and art. Earth began to heal, not just its biosphere, but its soul. The Spectre coils remained, a silent, dormant threat that now served not as a tool of empire, but as a stark reminder of the terrible responsibility that came with power. Eris Thorn was never tried. He was quietly exiled, allowed to live out his days in a small, isolated observatory in the Kuiper Belt. Watching the stars he had both saved and cursed. He had occasional visitors. One of them was Lyra, the Cathar archivist. She brought him old data slates, histories of fallen empires, and they would talk for hours about the great, cyclical patterns of civilization. "You became the monster to slay the monster," she said to him one day, as they watched a distant comet trail across the blackness. "And then you slew yourself. It is the story of every true hero, Eris Thorn, a story that is always written in tragedy." Eris looked out at the infinite, silent void. He had won no lasting peace, built no eternal empire. He had only bought his people time, a chance to be better, a chance they had nearly squandered. He had freed the prisoners, and then, in his final act, he had locked them in a much larger prison, the confines of their own conscience. "We are not gods," he whispered, his voice thin in the recycled air of the observatory. "We are just pathologically, irretrievably human. And perhaps, for the first time, that is enough." The pendulum had not settled. It never would. But in its long, slow swing between darkness and light, there was now a flicker of hope, a fragile, hard-won balance, purchased at the cost of one man's soul and the future of 5 forgotten worlds.